All right, I think we can go ahead and start. So just to let everyone know, we're going to be recording. We have already started recording, just a heads up. And thank you, Tim, Akshay, and everyone on the organizing committee for all of your work. And hi, everyone. My name is Jimin Rim. I'm a postdoc at Dartmouth College. Today, I'm excited to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Lisa White. Dr. White is a paleontologist and geologist, science educator, and advocate for diversity in geosciences. She is a micropaleontologist by training, holding a BA in geology from San Francisco State University and a PhD in earth sciences from the University of California, Santa Cruz. Currently, she is the Director of Education at the Museum of Paleontology at the University of California, Berkeley, where she develops learning materials for diverse audiences on topics including evolution, the fossil record, the process of science, and global change. Dr. White is also the chair of the AGU Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Committee and works to create a culture that embraces diversity and inclusiveness in the geosciences. In the past, during a 22-year career at the San Francisco State University, she's held positions as Professor of Geosciences, Geosciences Department Chair, Associate Dean of the Graduate Division, and Associate Dean of the College of Science and Engineering. She has received numerous awards and recognitions, a few of which include being named as Fellow of the California Academy of Sciences and Fellow of the Geological Society of America, as well as being the inaugural recipient of the GSA Bromery Award for Minorities. In the chat, we will drop 2 links to her recent publications that are relevant for her keynote address today. And just a quick note on the Q&A process. We will have a chance to ask Dr. White questions at the end of the talk. And during the talk, as you come up with questions, please put either an asterisk symbol in the chat or your full question written out in the chat if you don't want to turn on your camera or audio to read your own question. And I will be calling on people or reading the question in the order they were received in the chat. So with that, I will now hand it over to Dr. White. So please join me in welcoming her.
Great. Thank you so much, Jimin, for the introduction. And thank you to Tim and also to Akshay for the initial invitation to serve as a keynote speaker. I'm very honored. And I wish you all have a really wonderful symposium this weekend. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now and slides. And my goal in this talk is just to highlight ways that I've seen, particularly in the last year, opportunities to be leadership for change in geoscience. And change has taken on a new meaning when we think of the events of the past year and the different ways now we might be approaching the real need for equity, diversity, and inclusion in geoscience, and really the role of justice, really trying to get things right and really facing the opportunity to look at eliminating some of the systemic and institutional barriers that have really prevented us from advancing. And so my plan for the talk is to talk about what some of these forces were that really demanded change in a way that maybe we didn't see so quickly in past years, and what it means to take on this additional justice element for actionable change in geoscience. So the J and JEDI is justice, in addition to equity, diversity, and inclusion, and how those calls originated and how they're really playing out in the current climate. And as the chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Committee at AGU, I wanted to talk about the role of professional societies in general, and specifically, what are some of the things I've seen AGU be able to do that I never expected in my, I think this is my 35th year as a member of AGU. As Jimin mentioned, I was an undergraduate at San Francisco State University, in addition to later being a faculty member there. And so I joined AGU as an undergraduate student. And there was a specific meeting I remember as an undergrad. It's easy to be intimidated by an AGU conference, if especially if it's your first conference. And one year I walked in and I swear I walked out within a few minutes. I thought, I can't take this. I don't know why I even joined at the undergrad level. And so look at me now, I suppose, having a seat at the table. So you never know, right, where your trajectory will take you and how involved you find yourself in leading efforts that maybe you didn't expect to. And so one of the themes of my talk is just many of the ways that we can lead as individual scientists, as departments, as collective individuals who really care about issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think it's appropriate to ask ourselves often, why are we doing this work? It's not easy work. I certainly feel as if I've been doing it my whole career. I joke with graduate students at Berkeley that I supervised to say, we kind of had to do this on the sneak when we were graduate students, because back in the day, you really weren't encouraged to do this kind of work. And I realize that graduate students and early career professionals likely still hear, oh, don't spend too much time on those efforts. It won't count when you go up for tenure or promotion, or if you're looking for jobs. And there are parts of the current landscape that have changed, that why emphasize and why it's important to lead. But I often feel as if it's important to share, why this is essential for everyone. And that first point there, we really can operate at full capacity, especially with the kinds of demands that face the 21st century STEM workforce, if all qualified minds are not engaged. And individuals who are either in the workforce or hoping to be soon can't operate fully if they're burdened by racism and discrimination that is systemic and follows one throughout their career. And if we can't recognize and respond and support change for that, then we're never fully going to have the kind of workforce that we should ideally be aiming for. And point number 3 also goes without saying. Just think of the importance of environmental change, global change, topics of our time that need the earth science community to really have all hands on deck. And if we're not practicing inclusive strategies and ways of thinking that bring different minds on board, then we're forever going to be hindered by this lack of full participation. And I borrow this slide from Brandon Jones, is a NSF program officer in the Geo Directorate. And he often reminds us that when we talk about broader issues and even specific issues in diversity, some of the earlier ways of thinking really were about fixing the student. And even I have to admit, one of the first diversity programs that I was funded to run when I was a professor at San Francisco State really focused on pre-college students. So getting Bay Area high school students excited about geoscience through field trips and lab opportunities. But the assumption was always they were missing something. They didn't have an earth science class at their high school. Maybe they barely got outdoors and weren't really able to enjoy science or geoscience in the way that maybe many of us connected with the topic. So it was always assumed we need to fix them in some way. We need to get them trained the way we all were, and then they'd be welcome in the club and they should be fine. So it's that sort of old pipeline model. Let's just get them in and trained the way we all were. And so we're trying to get away from this notion of, don't try to fix the fish, don't fix the student. let's try to avoid that deficit model of operation. With the deficit model operation, meaning that there's something that's deficient or wrong with communities of color that we want to attract to the field. So maybe we need to look at us, maybe we need to look at the environment that we're putting students in, or underrepresented groups in, and check the temperature, check the climate of the institutions that we're part of. So we want to keep those things in mind, especially as times have shifted, and many of the funded programs more recently have been about the leadership. So those of us in positions to make change and initiate efforts, there's some training that we all need and best practices, so that we can reshape our institutions to be more welcoming to communities that have traditionally been underrepresented. So here comes the year 2020, right? So we've been told forever, really, that geosciences compared to the other STEM disciplines are underrepresented when it comes to communities of color, and certainly first-gen students and low income as well. But there were undeniable forces during 2020 that demanded that we relook at our discipline, at ways that inequities in the US have really prevented this full participation. So we can certainly agree that there was really a pandemic within the COVID-19 pandemic. When you look at the way that certain communities were affected, all the health disparities that came to light, this was a problem that required scientific solutions. And thank goodness for the communities of scientists, microbiologists that were at the forefront of working on the vaccine. And as much as we're living in a time where anti-science tends to trump scientific arguments, it was very clear that scientists are needed to be firmly established in helping this change. And we want to be certain that we're welcoming all members of our community. So I responded to opportunities to join a group of geoscientists of color to really call on the geosciences community to act, to not just stand in solidarity. I'm sure all of our institutions released letters after the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor murders, and we, doubled down on our commitments to diversity. But some of what was stated was certainly not true when you look at the practices and what's really going on at institutions. And so it was really our goal with the No Time for Silence group, which included geoscientists of all ethnicities, our allies, and like-minded folks who for years had been working on diversity matters, and wanted to say to not only universities, but also to funding agencies, governmental organizations, and nonprofits, that it's just not enough to say that you're down with equity and inclusion, full participation, and you support the voices of all people in the scientific community. There needs to be some level of action now. There's been enough years of research and programs. We're aware of some things that don't work. We need to shift from fixing the students to maybe fixing ourselves and our institutions, and re-examining, what kinds of academic and training environments, do we subject individuals to that make them not always be able to completely fulfill, their degrees or their career plans. And so taking action, in a meaningful way to ensure that goals that can lead to greater diversity of individuals in our disciplines is fulfilled. And so there was a petition, and there was a great amount of support for this work. And there have been opportunities to speak about what this change looks like. And the drivers of change over this past year have caused us to really think about the historical inequities in the US. I'm sure most of us were and probably still are part of reading groups, right? That give us time to reflect on the history of racial injustice in the US, how so much of what's systemic and institutionalized makes it difficult, even when we have innovative diversity programs in geoscience, they hit walls when we want to advance, move students on, promote professionals, hire, we're met with those same um, blocks and barriers. And then, of course, here comes the COVID crisis and the inequities that we saw as that played out. The term John Henryism is a way of describing what often happens to individuals of color that are part of STEM disciplines is we end up doing so much because we get called to be role models, to represent, to lead change. And it can be exhausting and not good for one's health. And I must say that what I'm mostly inspired about in this past year, as depressing as some things were, is there are truly more people at the table with some honest approaches to diversifying our discipline, or at least having honest conversation about what doesn't work and what are some ways we need to really confront our biases and have those difficult conversations that are not how we'd like to spend our time. We'd rather be in our labs or back out in the field when we can be, but it was necessary to have these kinds of conversations and remind our communities of the scholarly work that helps us gain perspective on why this has been such a problem in our country. And so what are some things we can do now that we shouldn't be silent anymore to move forward? And so you'll find on the No Time for Silence website and some of the petitions and related materials that were shared in the last year that there are some best practices and recommendations that we put forth. And it's all in this vein of we've got to act and lead and change and put into practice some of what can work if there's some dedication as well as resources and some different ways of thinking. So really asking all of our geoscience communities to invest in champion and advocating for others, making it a personal matter, not just leaving it to someone else in your department or that who always advocates for these communities. We really do need input from all members of our departments, whether they be early career or senior, whether they be a person of color or historically underrepresented or part of the majority group in geoscience. We need to be sure that we are listening and supporting and leading and developing these actionable strategies that demand that departments and institutions account for plans when they have them. So I'll talk about some of these specific plans, but also wanted to say that there were many other movements over this past year, right? So in addition to the call to action petition, there was another petition calling for a robust anti-racist approach to geoscience. Of course, AGU wasn't the only professional society that stepped up and elevated opportunities to talk and lead and have sessions at annual meetings and have strategic plans and diversity committees. So I'm very active in GSA as well. We're also grateful to some of the more recently funded projects like URGE, Unlearning Racism. So very much appreciate the work of Phoebe Cohen and Bashan Wright and their co-PIs and all the pods that you see across the country that are continuing those challenging conversations about what it means to be an anti-racist, to unlearn racism, and how we can really try to reshape our geoscience community. And there's also been times, especially with the No Time for Silence group, where we've had to joke a little bit and say, we kind of started out as some angry Black people and our friends, and look, now we received a presidential citation. And so at the fall meeting at AGU last December, we were honored with this surprise presidential award. And so I'm really grateful to Vernon Morris and also to Hindriata Ali for their work in leading us in these petitions. So how does this transfer then to meaningful action, and what are we asking people to do? And we talk so much, of course, about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It shows up in departmental plans for hiring and promotion, and so there's no question now that we're expecting professionals to have some exposure, expertise, a way of prioritizing this in their work. But I don't know that we're properly equipping each other to do it in a manner that's long lasting. And I think what's been refreshing about some of the newer, more recent conversations about what does equity, diversity, inclusion look like in our discipline and in professions in general is more emphasis on justice. So really doing what's right and facing the opportunity and the fact that at some point, we're going to have to deal with these systemic barriers that are not difficult to dismantle. But if you approach things from some different conversational ways, just remind folks about why things were set up the way they were, and they unfortunately were intentionally designed that way in many cases, but they don't have to stay that way. And so, reminding us that it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. What's often good in the spirit of diversity benefits entire departments and institutions. And so we don't want any old model of having to take a side or tear each other apart because we might be trying to elevate the participation of others. So I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about AGU's journey. Remember, this is coming from someone who's been a member 35 years, and I'm sure many of you have been members for your professional and student careers. And I never really expected much from AGU. That's not a slight to them, but the biggest professional earth science society, the deep roots in geophysical science. And for a lot of my history with AGU, equity inclusion was the last thing on their mind. So, I didn't expect that much, but through the years, I thought, why shouldn't we be expecting more? I mean, we need all hands on deck. Our science touches all corner of the world. We have active international participation of scientists. We should be elevating the participation of all scientists of all ethnicities. So it's been fascinating to watch all of this happen and the lessons learned along the way. And I think what's helped with AGU, well, a number of things have, really looking at opportunities to take seriously, the professional conduct of scientists. And it's difficult, and as much as there are still some problems with people not minding the conduct and behaving in ways that are opposite to that, we are making people more accountable for their behavior. And these are firmly embedded in the policies that we see, not only at AGU, but other professional societies and at all the institutions where we work. But to be able to elevate that and make it very clear that there's a certain expectation with how one treats their fellow scientists that should be deeply rooted in respect and honesty and equity. And so along with that, there have been opportunities to provide support and services for intervening when there our problems, and being more aware of the role of biases, and workshops that are more commonplace, but AGU's emphasis and priority on having safer meetings has been an important part of this change. And so as time went on, articulating a diversity and inclusion strategic plan was certainly seen as an important natural next step. And then additional strategic plans have evolved from that, as well as specific DEI initiatives. So let me keep walking through what some of these are. And you can find all of these materials on AGU's website. And in 2018, there was a working group or a task force for diversity and inclusion. So I wasn't on it, but was getting wind and paying attention to what they were doing, and how, again, this big professional organization was really going to make a plan that was applicable and realistic when it came to diversity and inclusion, that moved just beyond, having maybe a dozen, if that, sessions on education and outreach or diversity and inclusion, which always seemed to be scheduled, on the last day, that Friday of the fall meeting, in some dark, far room in Moscone. So been through those days too, but grateful that the task force spent several years coming up with a plan and recommended a standing D&I advisory committee, along with other things. And so I was asked to chair that. And then several years later, really saw the shift at AGU where the diversity and inclusion strategic plan wasn't separate. It was fully incorporated into AGU's new strategic plan that still prioritizes, of course, the importance of our science and the importance of solutions to scientific and societal challenges, and elevating all the expertise we have in our professional society to tackle those tough problems. But we also make it clear, AGU makes it clear through this, that we can't do that work well and completely without promoting and exemplifying an inclusive scientific culture, and being open to the kinds of partners with other kinds of organizations to help face these societal challenges. And so programs like the Thriving Earth Exchange, where there are opportunities for communities to come to the proverbial table in ways that elevate scientific concerns that they may have in communities, whether they be Native American tribal communities or small coastal communities and fishing villages around the world that are facing sea level change. We want to be sure we're hearing from those individuals and the traditional ecological knowledge that they can share to the benefit of us. And then last year, just along this timeline of what AGU is doing, really recognizing ways to address systemic racism within the professional society, and in ways that hopefully do influence and inspire the real need for change in the institutions that we are part of. And you really need multiple points of priorities, right? Because again, it's not just enough to say that you're going to do something. Doing something requires funding. And so the ability for AGU to attract different sorts of grants and donations and fellowships to elevate efforts. We've seen efforts to diversify AGU's governance and committees. And so not only having a standing diversity and inclusion committee, but being sure that we're encouraging underrepresented scientists within AGU to consider service on other kinds of committees. And we want to reward people for the kind of work that they do, and have a system that allows us to evaluate, a whole array of different kinds of expertise and depth that people bring to their careers that is worthy, of ownership. And so with these 8 elements that, again, were a way of AGU elevating actionable items and steps and focus areas to try to begin to address systemic racism. And there are AGU staff members that are assigned to each of these 8 elements. And so that helps to prioritize and systematize these actionable strategies to be sure that they're not forgotten and that folks are actually working on this. So, and this list as well, some of it's repeated from points I mentioned earlier that were part of this timeline of how does a large professional society that we could argue for years was very conservative and run by similar kinds of individuals. Now, how do you get that society to embrace some different ways of thinking? How do you resource an organization to allow them to make changes? And so the AGU Ethics and Equity Resource Center that Billy Williams directs has been an important part of this effort at having, a place at AGU where there's the kind of training, and there are partnerships with other organizations to do climate surveys and be informed by practices that we know have really started to influence the way that we think about how we deal with many of these challenges. And funding from different kinds of grants, so targeted funds that allow some of this work to unfold. And then we talked about the strategic plan and the 8 deliberate steps. And one of the newest kinds of resources that the Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Committee has been really grateful to be able to weigh in on is this demographic dashboard that is becoming available for AGU, where it'll be much easier for members to see, how's AGU doing and what is the membership makeup and how are we doing on honors and other awards in terms of the diversity of recipients, and is a way, again, to sort of check the progress. So a few other things I want to share here. It's been a year for webinars, virtual workshops, right? And opportunities to discuss with others, what are we doing? What are some of these communities of practice that we can learn from? How can we motivate each other to try to dismantle some of these systemic structures? And how can we continue to just be inspired from the stories of others? And so I've been involved as well with members of the Diversity Committee at AGU and with other professional societies, the National Association of Black Geoscientists, Geological Society of America. We're partnering with one of the newest groups in geosciences, AAPI in geoscience, and they'll be joining us for this next workshop, which will be on May 4th. So if you go to the Equity and Ethics, the Ethics and Equity Center, you can see the information and the registration form. So we just released this yesterday, and so we're already having signups, and we really welcome you to join us on May 4th. And it'll be an opportunity to just reflect. On the one hand, we're exhausted, right? I mean, this is not easy work. And there are times when I do feel like, honestly, I'm having the same conversation with people, but then I will go to a workshop and think, oh, this is great. We are getting places, and I really am hopeful. I tend to default to optimism anyway, but still, this work is not for everyone who doesn't have some energy. And so we think it's important that we continue to support each other and let it be known, what is working and what's going on, and especially with the new URGE group and the URGE pods, there are great opportunities to not only grow the network, but to help, shape perceptions on how we lead and maybe revisiting just some of the norms that we have gotten too comfortable and used to. So I want to shift now. I started with just all the forces of change and the year 2020, certainly extending into this year too, with the change in leadership nationally in the White House and the constant attention that JEDI action is having and deserves if we're really to respond to the changing climate of the workforce and needs that is demanded by 21st century scientists. And so seeing AGU respond in the way that they did, I wanted to share a few more of the kinds of initiatives and leadership opportunities, and then I'll shift to a few things I'm doing at the Museum of Paleontology at UC Berkeley to just try to carry forward just strategies and initiatives for change. And AGU received an NSF grant last year to develop what they're calling Landing, so Leadership Academy for networking and diversity and inclusion in the geosciences. And so these three elements here of AGU Landing will center around forming communities of practice. So professionals interested in leading a change and being better versed in what are some of these actionable strategies, what works, how do we cultivate a climate of change and build future champions. And so this academy, there'll be meetings, of course, some in person as we're able to travel and meet in person. There will be opportunities for institutional development. And hopefully all of these will feed back into one another so that individual scientists feel as if they are professionally growing and being better equipped to stand for the kind of change that we hope has inspired them to do this work, and then of course bring that back to their institutions. So stay tuned for that. And they're the first set of AGU Landing participants has been decided for this year, but every year of this 3-year project, there'll be new cohorts. So lots of opportunities to participate in this work and hopefully transform the system and be an advocate and a leader for others. And here are just some reasons why we'd want to participate in this work. That large question I asked early on in the talk, which might seem obvious. Again, why do this work? Why participate? And it goes beyond because it's good for you. It's not just that, you know, it's really great for our communities to think more broadly this way about the whole concept of, you know, it truly is going to take all of us, the village, the collective, our departments, our universities to lead this actionable change. And again, the problems of the 21st century that scientists will face and hopefully solve some of them requires all hands on deck. So I want to, in the last couple minutes, just checking time here, talk about what are some things that I've been prioritizing at the Museum of Paleontology. So I suppose I could argue that my career started out in a very traditional fashion, although I didn't do a postdoc after I finished at UC Santa Cruz back in 1990. I was able to have a faculty position right after graduation at my alma mater. So I have not literally gone far from home. I still live in San Francisco. Yes, I do travel and get out, but you know, my professional career has been here. So when Berkeley encouraged me to apply for the current position I have, I thought, well, you know, I love the museum's web resources. In the time I've been at the museum, we've celebrated 25 years on the web. And I know it's hard to think of a time when we weren't dependent on virtual learning, but in the early 90s when the web was in its infancy, the UCMP was one of the first 100 websites really anywhere in the world. And that's been the primary way to this day that we share our education and outreach materials, that we communicate with the public. But I find myself asking, well, are we reaching, everyone though, really in the same way? And, who are we creating these resources for? I mean, we say generally for the public, for K through 12 teachers, but there was not a lot of demographic analysis. And although we have plenty of resources in multiple languages, I found opportunities to really try to reach more diverse audiences through programs that not didn't always or just depend on what we were sharing on the web. But I'm still very much invested in our web resources. But I began with a range of different kinds of funding, creating partnerships with two-year colleges, with the ocean sciences community. So in my research training in microfossils, I'm a veteran of several IODP, International Ocean Discovery Program cruises, and I've reconnected with the IODP community through partnerships with educators and getting teachers out on the drill ship, as well as graduate students and even undergrads. And we really want to support, Black, Indigenous, people of color, BIPOC scholars. And so through some of these partnerships, we've been able to create ambassadors for the science. So students who are excited about communicating aspects of science to non-scientists and to their communities in ways that we think people can relate to. We want to, through our web resources, continue to increase the accessibility of information, just break it all down and explain things in ways that folks can relate to. And with our newest web resource called Understanding Global Change, that I'll highlight in a minute, we really want to raise awareness about climate science in particular. So these are just some of the logos from the various programs that I direct, and I'll walk you through a few of them. And one of the programs, and back to our web resources though, which are still very much at the heart of our education outreach programs. Understanding Science is one of the websites in our Understanding series. So there's Understanding Evolution, Understanding Science, then our newest one is Understanding Global Change. And on the Understanding Science website, there's what we call the science flowchart, or how science works, or how science really works. When you're introducing students to science for the first time, textbooks are ripe with the scientific method. It reads like just a cookbook of, you formulate ideas, you propose a hypothesis, you of course have methods that include collecting data and drawing on evidence, but many times the way the scientific approach is transferred doesn't sound very exciting, right? And students can't always see themselves in that, if they're not a scientist already. So through this flow chart, and if you're on the website, these are all clickable, and there are elements within testing ideas and exploration and discovery, benefits and outcomes, community analysis and feedback that we can certainly all relate to as scientists. And we have some new ways of interacting with that flowchart on the website. So not only are fields clickable, but you can drag and drop between sub concepts and make a digital map, if you will. But I often remind not only the scientists I work with at UCMP, but also in the various collaborative groups that, science is by nature a community endeavor. And, it relies on a number of things. Of course, it's driven by evidence, a system of checks and balances, and moves in a direction that we hope leads to greater accuracy. And all of this feeds back on each point. And so hence the arrows going in these very directions. And this system, though, best operates when there is diversity within the scientific community, within scientific disciplines, within scientific approaches, from the areas where we grew up, our race and ethnicity and gender identity, and everything we bring to our full self is worth bringing to your science, and influences the way that you think and inspires others. So using some of our toolkits, using materials like this to really inspire students to think about, who does science and how they do it, and follow and track and trace a scientist and their career can be really, really inspiring. And in addition to that resource that we've had for a while, but new ways of sharing it in the spirit of diversity, we've been super excited through the lead of our director of the museum, Charles Marshall, and Jessica Bean as the lead scientist on this project, launch a new website in the Understanding series. And with the Understanding series, so understanding evolution, understanding science, and now global change, the philosophy has been, well, we're not afraid to take on the big ideas. We brought on evolution, nature and process of science. Okay, so we're ready to tackle global change in a web resource. But this one was really different for us in that we put a lot more emphasis on the graphic interface for this website. There are a series of building blocks that include individual icons that represent either the driver or causes of change. There are icons in the Earth system. One's just shown here, the greenhouse effect, that we know are systems, are parts of the system that respond to perturbations, driven by these various causes. And then, of course, the measurable changes in the Earth system, the things that we spend a lot of time on as individual scientists looking at impact. So this is a fully interactive feature on this site. You can even change the background diagram that you see here. You can swap in a photograph if you happen to work in a certain area of the world where you're mapping out what the drivers and impacts of change are. One can do that. It's intended to be used in a variety of settings, not only formal education, but informal. And we wanted to make it possible to construct models of what this change looks like. And so one makes essentially concept maps of how aspects of global change are connected. We know that there are numerous websites about global change and climate change, some good ones, of course, through NOAA and other agencies, all of the work of the federal level scientists who have been monitoring and tracking change. But we wanted, from an education perspective, for folks who may not be as familiar with global and climate change as many of us are, to be able to picture what this looks like. And so this is one of these full concept maps, and you can go to these resources at ugc.berkeley.edu, and you can get to this website through a variety of ways to construct a model. But here, what we've done, and this is a model for how sea level rises, one driver for sea level rise. It's driven by the burning of fossil fuels. And so you make the logical connection to greenhouse gases and the greenhouse effect. So now we've perturbed part of the Earth system, and we can see what all changes after that. And you just follow the arrows, all these click points. So one is we dragged and dropped these icons from the menu here. And so these pull down menus are great. Students, users can type in additional notes of what's going on. And so it's just a great way to track a phenomenon. And it's also a terrific way to make a local connection to global change. If a community, no matter where they are, we're all dealing in some way with the impacts of global change. And if one wants to just map it out and think about all those connections, no matter where they might be, of what those impacts are, then we find this to be an empowering way to really think about how the science plays out in ways that maybe folks can relate to more. So the last program I'll talk about, and again, I constantly think about, what am I doing, or am I doing enough? I've, been working in the DEI space for a long time, but it's hard sometimes to see what the results have been, and always I think we are continually being told, we're not quite doing enough if we're measuring enough by the numbers of BIPOC individuals, of underrepresented groups in our discipline. And that's a slow change. And I find myself just again, wanting to keep busy and lead with opportunities, especially for graduate students and early career scientists, to get the kind of professional development and inspiration they need to do this work. And this project, Advancing Community College Education and Student Success, or Access Paleo, was really inspired by a graduate student. Larry Taylor here, who's now finished his PhD last year and teaching at a two-year college. He was in the Seth Finnegan lab at Berkeley, and he taught community college between his master's and his doctoral degrees, and kept asking me, why aren't we doing more for community colleges? And I never had a good answer. So finally, I thought, yes, we need to do something. So this program was born 3 years ago. And of course, when we were able to meet in person, it was very much about bringing students, two-year college students in the Bay Area, to the Berkeley campus for labs. We would coordinate with the instructors, the graduate students would lead them, and it was a great way to support some of our diversity initiatives at the UCMP, plus invest in graduate students. And we haven't missed a step, though, with the switch to remote teaching. So the graduate students have led the way in this as well, in making open access and virtual labs that can be done asynchronously or synchronously. So they drop in some of the two-year college classes that are doing the labs, and we keep growing different kinds of labs. So we have about 8 or 10 of them now, and it's been really wonderful. It goes without saying to see the graduate students really get on board with this work, and we've been able to get some funding over the last year to support them in doing this work. So the last few slides here, we just want to circle back to the No Time for Silence and what were some of the main messages that we were really trying to transfer and inspire in others to take these more action-oriented strategies. And so you'll find these on the website, but some of them include, just moving beyond just only wanting to increase numbers of individuals from diverse backgrounds in our profession. I mean, that's a big part of it, but we need to change the climate of our institutions so that we are in many ways just continuing to monitor what it is we're doing that should inspire more equitability. And there's so much that goes along with that, just not always thinking about putting students in certain degree programs that were exactly the way that we learned. And so we need to really embrace the different pathways that people come to the discipline. Oops, sorry about that. And then mentoring is so important, as well as increasing role models and faculty and administrative leadership. These things cost money, as we know, and we want to be able to reward people for this work. There's been opportunities to learn from and partner with some of the historically Black colleges, the minority serving institutions, and the two-year colleges present us with some good models for how to get things done, even in times when they're under-resourced. And so we should be looking to bring resources and partnership opportunities. And 7.7 there is one we need to continue to remind ourselves not to fall to this. No false binaries. Just because you are working on diversity initiatives and want to promote inclusivity doesn't mean that you're giving up some kind of quality. So that's important, number one. And just the last slide here. So professional societies clearly do play important roles in being able to advocate for the kind of work that we hope to do in diversity and inclusion and equity. And our gatherings, of course, present spaces and opportunities for us to present our work. And I wanted to point out, and many of you may have noticed this issue at the end of last year, but this special issue that invited a range of contributions on how we're shaping the future of geoscience and ways of reimagining it that could reflect some of these best practices and answer workforce needs and inspire that next generation. And so it's worth just looking at not only articles like this, but there were a whole series of blogs and continue to be over the last year that I think inspire us to think differently about how to be more diverse and inclusive in our work. So just want to thank some of the individuals at AGU that have been so supportive of this work and directing many of the diversity initiatives. And then just thank some of the members, the many members of the UCMP community that I'm very fortunate to work with. So, okay, I think I went on a little longer than was initially planned, but we still have time for questions, right? So thank you very much. Really appreciate being able to talk to all of you today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Wright. That was very informative and inspiring. Thank you for walking us through all of the different actions taken by the AGU and other professional societies and providing us with all of these resources, and especially walking us through all of these different examples, initiatives being taken at, by UCMP. So we have a few questions lined up. I would like to encourage students and early career scholars to either put it in the chat or direct message it to me. First question is from Rebecca Smith. Please unmute yourself and ask the question.
Yes. Hi, thank you so much, Dr. White. That was really inspiring and motivating. So as part of the URGE, I'm a PhD student at UMass Amherst, and as part of our URGE pod, we've been trying to implement a bias reporting tool in our department. And one of the biggest problems we've been facing is not from the students' involvement, it's been faculty pushback. Right. And in fact, even not just faculty, when we took it beyond faculty to deans, they just give us the phrase like it's not possible. So I guess my question is two-pronged. One, how do you incentivize faculty to participate? Does it have to be like they need some sort of, they have to be held accountable by someone higher up? And then I'm just wondering like how to get faculty on board with certain efforts, because when they're not on board, it really slows all of the efforts down. I know. And then my other question is, you know, like if a dean or a faculty says this isn't possible and you're saying that's not an adequate answer, where can you go from there? Like, do you take it to social media? I don't want to jeopardize the degree, but how do you demand change safely as a student?
Okay, those are great questions, and they are some of the most challenging parts of driving change when you have to face the role of faculty in doing this, because we need them to lead as well. And so I'll share a few thoughts. So the Equity and Ethics Center at AGU, they've partnered with one of the advanced programs. So that's an NSF funded program that supports leadership in women to achieve more administrative positions. And let's see, Erica Marin Spiotto, she's at the University of Wisconsin, and so she leads the advanced program there. But they've shared really a range of resources that have helped to try to tackle the faculty program or the faculty challenges. And so if you look at some of the resources on the AGU equity site, you'll see some of the advanced resources. And I know they've helped to shape some of the climate surveys, and many of those have been informed by some of the roadblocks in departments that are problematic. But I'm also going to put in the chat, Rebecca, there's a new program run out of Lamont Doherty and Columbia that's called All Aboard. These acronyms crack me up, but I like this one and I advise it, but it's Alliance Building Offshore to Achieve Resilience and Diversity, but you'll see the link in the chat for All Aboard. And so with All Aboard, so cohorts of individuals from the same institution are invited to apply for opportunities to team build, strategize, be informed by best practices to lead. And it requires a faculty member, someone at the dean level to apply. And so the first cohorts are being selected now, but it's a multi-year program. So there'll be individuals and groups invited in the future. And actually, two of the PIs are UMass alumni. So Benjamin Kiesling and Raquel Bryant. I know you know well in their early careers who are doing a lot and inspiring us all.
How about this? This is great. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. And I felt like at UMass, you have some buy-in from faculty, but you know who they are, only a handful. And it's so frustrating. In my years at San Francisco State, I had two associate dean positions in the graduate division and also in the College of Science and Engineering. And, we talk about just herding cats. And even when you are an administrator in an influential position, it's tough. But there are resources now and at least approaches that demand that faculty participate. And I know it's slow change, but a lot of programs are prioritizing, the role of faculty. So I hope that's helpful. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Thank you both.
Sure.
And thank you, Rebecca, for the question as well. This is a question I've had for a long time as well.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah, so we have a couple questions from an individual through direct message. So I'll read both. Feel free to answer in whichever order you prefer. The first question is, how can geoscience students get started on anti-racism initiatives on campus and within the local community? And then the second question is, how do you get international students from homogeneous societies to understand and participate in anti-racism US geoscience environment?
Okay, and those, of course, are both such great questions and very relevant to programs I've been thinking about recently. And with students and particularly undergraduate students or even graduate students in their first years who want to get involved in different anti-racism initiatives, we'll look to see if there's an URGE pod on their campus, on your campus. But honestly, I found that I looked outside of the geoscience department when I was first getting involved in diversity initiatives that were mostly still connected to science fields. I ended up looking to see what groups were doing in biology. There were more students of color in the life sciences at all the institutions where I've been. And so I was looking at levels of activism there and also looking at what was going on in the social sciences. I should share that my father was a professor at San Francisco State. I'm second generation, and he was there. So when I was a kid, he was a faculty member during the year that San Francisco State went on strike. The students led this strike. So mostly students that were Black or Latinx or Native American, because they were so frustrated with the lack of a curriculum that reflected their life experience. And so they really forced the university to change. And so the College of Ethnic Studies was born and all that. But I found myself looking to see, remembering that from my childhood. And then as I was a college student, just watching student activists, there were times when I thought they spent too much time, with a megaphone, and I'm just trying to go to lab and do my work. And they're out there mobilizing us, whether it was the anti-apartheid movement, or the various propositions in California that have made it difficult to elevate affirmative action. There were ways of organizing and really forcing communities, the whole university community, to talk about efforts. And so I wasn't always on every, marching or picket line, but I was very inspired and continue to be by student organizers who, bring voice to a lot of issues. And so sometimes learning some practices that are applied in other departments or other parts of campus and bringing that back. But I think has, I suppose, been a plus about the current way we all communicate is it's easier to form affinity groups. I've seen students connect with others on Twitter, and now, they're leading an effort that is across campuses. So that's really inspiring. And then the second question about how international students or international scientists can be involved and also learn more about the systemic challenges of racism in our society. And I think that's been brought to light even more intensely over the past month with the examples of racism and injustice in the Asian American and Pacific Islander community, and all showing us just all of the obvious reasons why we do all need to support one another and learn more about the history of various communities of color in the US and our connections to our international arms of the diaspora. But what I've been hoping for and seeing is that scientists in our institutions and in our networks who came to the US as international students, or who are members of AGU and representing, a different country, spend time, learning about the issues and trying to get a sense for, why it's especially important now to emphasize this. And, when we launched this demographic dashboard, the AGU Diversity and Inclusion Committee was providing input to the AGU designers of the dashboard. And we went round and round about the different ethnic categories and how we were going to either ask individuals about their race or ethnic origin, because we know these mean different things to someone from the US versus someone from another country. So we're very sensitive to that. And there are members of our diversity advisory board that are international members of AGU. And so they continue to inform the discussion as well, because it is very much a global problem. I mean, there are oppressed people all over the world, but we also want to recognize that if you're from a country that is mostly homogenous, there's still always, class and hierarchical issues that can be parallel to some of the experiences of others, but talking about it, sharing examples, and having difficult discussions that are sometimes necessary to explain, why we need to champion, the rights of others and what we can learn from one another when we learn more about our histories, I think is really positive. So thanks for those questions.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I also have a family who doesn't live in the States. So this is something that I've been thinking about a lot. So I really appreciate both the question and the answer. And I think we have one last question from Tim. If you could unmute yourself and ask away.
Hi, I'd like to sort of piggyback on Rebecca's question in terms of hearing your opinion about the role of faculty in making meaningful changes in their departments. And I've heard a recommendation by a number of people that working in DEI spaces should be something that's considered in tenure review to try to promote this. And I'm curious, if departments genuinely are willing to prioritize this, by definition, that priority means the time needs to come from somewhere else. And I worry that some of there's this natural instinct to just put things on, and obviously minoritized groups have been taking, doing the brunt of this labor over time. But what's your recommendation for, especially at traditional research-focused institutions, how do you work against the inertia against, research being king and not giving the space to actually give faculty the necessary time to do this work?
Right. Yeah, it is one of the most difficult parts of seeing the actionable strategies transfer to real change because of this very reason. I mean, it does take time to incorporate best practices, even learning about ways to be more diverse and inclusive can be time away, from the lab and research, and tenure and promotion policies are only slowly, catching up to how to best prioritize this work and reward individuals for it. And then it still gets put in the service category that's not the same as, research and teaching. And so when I've been asked to provide input, I respond in a couple of ways. There are many ways to show your commitment to diversity, and some may be easy or easier or more in line with the priorities of a lab. And so, of course, having a diversity of students in one's lab, supporting the graduate students and the postdocs in the lab to not be the ones spending all the time on diversity, but recognizing that there are strengths that they bring to doing things maybe differently, or thinking about what it means to build a lab community that's inclusive, so that diversity, equity, inclusion work can be about the people that a faculty member mentors and supports in their lab, and to what level of encouragement they may be giving to those individuals who want to do this kind of work. Because in the past, not only was the faculty member not prioritizing DEI, but it seems they were discouraging their students from doing it because of all the reasons that are, they would say are typical from it takes too much time or it's not important. So I'm inspired by that shift I see. It's like, oh, at least some of these profs who maybe they're not as comfortable or can't quite wrap their time completely around DEI are okay, if their graduate students or postdocs are spending time. So I think, well, that's a step. And also I just try to promote some of the best practices and the geoscience education research that is filling volumes about what works for just learning, that's really wonderful for all communities. In fact, let me just put something else in the chat. So I was fortunate to participate in an effort to think about what the 21st century degree should look like in geoscience. And so we called this vision and change effort. A few years ago in the biological sciences community, there was a gathering that was supported by AAAS to examine what our modern biology degree should look like. And, it should be filled with opportunities to interact with real data and prioritize working in multidisciplinary aspects of biology and so on and so forth. So about 8 years ago, there was an effort that I participated in to bring together geoscience faculty and administrators to look at what we should be training students for in this next century, considering what the workforce priorities are. But I bring this up because that document has a lot of terrific ways that departments can modernize and think about how students learn and prepare them for a whole range of jobs. And there are sections of that document that do highlight diversity and inclusive practices and ways to really feed back to a department in a way that can bring more students of color. And so faculty were responsive to that, just planning on the departmental level and in ways that are more strategic of how, diversity, equity, inclusion can be applied and good for that. But it still does often end up being, fewer faculty members in a department than many. But at least it is put or elevated in ways that I didn't think I would see several years ago. But yeah, these are still discussions that are happening, but there's a lot more data out there and many materials like the one I just shared that show examples of how it can work, why it's good for a department, and ways of incorporating, more diverse practices that can reward faculty and change the culture, but it is often a slow change. But there are ways of doing it. So. Great. Well, thank you all. Are there any additional questions?
I believe that was the last question we have. Let's give another round of applause to Dr. White virtually. Thank you all for staying, and thank you so much, Dr. White, for giving us all of these additional resources as well.
Sure.
I believe that we have a social gathering in about 10 minutes at GatherTown. Tim just dropped the link in the chat, so I hope to see many of you there as well. And thank you for coming.
Great. And you all have a great symposium, and really appreciate your invitation, and thanks for sharing some of the resources in the chat that were in my slides. And yeah, if you ever have questions about those resources or want to get involved in some of these initiatives at AGU, please contact me, and we just welcome your participation. All right, we'll see you later. Thank you again. Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.